Welcome back to another episode of the Midlife Podcast, where we have curious conversations about what it means to walk the way of Jesus as we live out the midlife life in communion with God, in community with God's people, and committed to the cause of the kingdom. I'm Haley Gregory, and as you might notice if you've been watching us on YouTube, we're in a different format this time because we have a virtual guest, and that is so fun, and we're so excited for that today. And we are just excited to be back talking once again about hospitality and how the early church and how Christians have engaged in hospitality. Once again, I'm joined by my lovely and esteemed co-host, Miss Gloria Kim. So, Glo, thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited. It's been such a journey to co-host this really precious series on hospitality. And today I'm very excited to introduce Jared Mackey. He's one of our pastor's dear friend, one of the OGs who got connected when Pastor Nero first moved out to Denver and asked for a trailer to haul all the sound equipment. So, yeah, Jared, would love to hear a little bit more about you if you'd like to introduce about yourself and, what has hospitality looked like in your personal life or in your communal life?
That sounds great. Well, lovely to be with you all. Thanks so much for the invitation. Love LifeGate and the ministry, not only that it serves in creating a place of worship for people here in our city, but also the service it provides so many. So, my story is my father was a Baptist minister. My family moved up to Greeley in 1980. So Colorado was not as cool to live in 1980 as it is now. My story was we moved here, and really it was the hospitality of other people because we moved here right as the economy fell apart. And so my family would glean fields on the weekends with migrant workers. We were really the beneficiaries of the hospitality and generosity of people in our local congregation up in Greeley for several years, just for my family to kind of exist. So by 83, my family moved down to Denver, and that's where I spent my childhood, a number of churches down here. I had no intention of ever working with or for churches, but God had a different idea, which is a whole other maybe podcast.
He always does.
So by, 93, I end up with some friends who had started a Tuesday night Bible study, being involved in that, and ended up working for the same faith community for 25 years. So a lot of my story was formed by that community of faith, which was younger demographic. And all of us were trying to figure out, I think, like, what did it look like to be hospitable? Some of the faith traditions that we came out of, specifically some churches felt like they were not exactly welcoming. And so I think we were trying to figure out what did it look like to be welcoming. And so one of the things that we said every week for 25 years is that you are welcome here just as you are. Because we felt like that was more of the posture of Jesus. Like when you see the life of Jesus, he seems to always be accepting people right where they are, not intending that they stay there, but always welcoming and inviting them in at that point and place. So, like a lot of my story has been, I think, figuring out what does it look like to welcome people both into the kingdom, welcome people into faith communities. I happen to be sitting outside of a coffee shop, so you're going to probably hear some background noise because somewhere along the line, at least I would say in the last 30 or 40 years, the coffee shop kind of became the community place, the welcoming place in our culture. And so, this is where I run into people, families, kids, etc. But it's also, I think, where everybody in our culture kind of is like, oh, that's the place that I go, where I'm welcomed and invited. And how would people reframe and see church and the faith community as such? So it's awesome. Here, I really feel like that we should say, see, this is just real life. We're good.
It is real life, and I love that. I actually really love the idea of that the coffee shop is a place where people encounter, right? Where they have this encounter with others, and what does that encounter lead to? Jared, I'm going to switch up some of the order of these questions because as you started talking,
bring it on.
Obviously Denver and Colorado 30 years ago looked very different than how it does today. Obviously, we have had an explosion of growth, I would say probably in the last 10 to 15 years as a
Yeah.
city specifically. And so as Denver has grown, and we talk about this a lot at LifeGate around like that we are a fairly transient city, right? Like there's a lot of people who come here for
Yeah.
a season and then leave, and clearly that's not you and that's not your
Yeah.
experience here. So how do you engage with hospitality in a space where you have all these people who are maybe coming and going at different frequencies or different intervals, and with
Yeah.
people who are maybe like living more transient, whatever that looks like, even if it's professional transientism, right, where somebody's here for just a small stint of a job? Like, what does hospitality look like in that, as you're trying to engage in that?
Yeah, that's a great question, Haley. I think one of the things that I'm really interested in is what did the kingdom and what has the kingdom looked like here in Denver before us, right? And so one of the
Yeah.
things and projects and initiatives that I've been working on for the last couple of years with some very good friends is a project called Histories of Christianity in Our City, in which we just talk about how have people faithfully followed the way of Jesus in our city before us. So if you go back to the very origins of Denver, 1880s, it's after the gold rush, it's the silver boom. But Denver kind of still has a lot of the same characteristics as we did in 1880, right?
It's true.
Which is like people are out here to kind of strike it rich, whatever that might look like, right? And so one of the phrases that we've used over the last couple of years is Denver's great if you're doing great. And that's kind of always been that way, right? So if you happen to hit the gold or silver boom, then Denver was great. Or if you happen to be an early tech person, like a lot of my friends were in the early 2000s, Denver was great. Or maybe if you were a startup business, because Denver has this startup culture, you know, if your name happened to be Steve Ells and you created this burrito place called Chipotle, like Denver's great if you're doing great, right? But for all the stories of people that Denver's been great because they were doing great, there's also the story of all along the way from the people who were brought into Denver to build Denver and build the railroad, that life wasn't great, right? And migrant workers who were brought in, that life was not great. And you can basically trace the story of Denver. And I would offer kind of on the lens of hospitality, there's always been a need for people, and specifically the church, to welcome in the outsider that is not able to make their own fortune, right?
Yeah,
and I think
yeah.
the challenge in that in Denver is there's just enough Wild West that Denver is, like, I would say every city has like maybe like a signature sin, something that's unique in the soil. And I think one of the signature sins of our city is like a rugged individualism. And so if you take like the rugged individualism that is like in the story and in the soil of Denver from 1880 to, 2025, rugged individualism and hospitality feel like that they are a little bit at odds. When you just step back and ask anybody, do you think rugged individualism is synonymous with like gracious hospitality?
Yeah, no. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Oh man, Jared, you and I could talk for days about the history of Denver. I actually was I studied the history of Denver for my senior history thesis in college at the University of Denver. So we could talk, and I wrote my whole thing was about the ecumenical movement to oppose Hitler in the 1930s. Anyways, we could talk for days about that.
Totally,
we should definitely connect. That is not the purpose of this conversation. But I really love that contrast, right? Rugged individualism and hospitality. And it's true, and I think we struggle with that in our LifeGate context of people who feel like, yes, I'm committed here, but they have no roots really, right? Like they're not here. They're here to prove themselves as an individual and not figure out how they fit in the communal life of this city. And I think that was a really astute point. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, what you said about like, how do you encourage hospitality in transient culture? And I would offer that like some of it is like we have to reframe what hospitality means from a more of a biblical lens.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes we're formed more by Martha Stewart than we are by Jesus. So hospitality can be like, I create a beautiful place and I invite people in. as somewhat of like a mental construct. But I would offer like that Jesus was the most hospitable person. And as best as we understand, Jesus never had a home in which he like had perfect candles and perfect decor and, you know, perfect charcuterie board laid out for guests to come over for happy hour, right? So
Yeah.
I do think we have to understand that hospitality is more than environment creation. It's actually more of a posture of our soul, in which my friend Carrie Jenkins, who I believe you guys had on this podcast, would
Yes.
say like hospitality is the receiving of the authentic you, but it's also the giving of the authentic me, right? And so there's that level of authenticity that no matter where you are or for how long, I would say one of the most hospitable things that you can be is authentically you, and
Yeah.
inviting and creating space for other people to be authentically them.
Yeah. Wow.
No, I really enjoyed our conversation with Carrie. Like, it shifted a whole perspective of viewing hospitality as a practice that we have to do something about it into like an identity form. Like, we carry a hospitable self and a being wherever we go, and in every interaction that we have, even if it might not be over a meal or over a table, like we can still live out a hospital life. And that was just like a really mind-blowing concept that I've got to interact with.
To be clear, Carrie is like the Jedi of hospitality in our city. So I'm like somewhere, like if she's like Yoda, we'll just kind of do like, I'm like Obi-Wan Kenobi, like fumbling around out in the desert, occasionally getting a couple of things right. So.
Oh, that was a great reference. I appreciate that.
Yeah, love the Star Wars reference. Well, I would love to hear then, to touch base a little bit about the individualistic culture that we live in here. What were some practical ways that it helped you posture your heart if you are like from the West, you know, like I think culturally, like the biblical context back in the day, people would naturally, the culture is formed naturally in collective mindset. Like, what I serve is for the better of the collective good. Whereas like here is like, how can I find a collective group that could sort of find or help me find where I fit and belong, sort of like to serve me and find my identity. So like in that different culture, how are some ways that we can shift our postures of our hearts in approaching hospitality in our modern days?
The thought that pops into my mind is, I think somewhat of the shift might be, we see hospitality from an individualistic point, which is how do people perceive me, and maybe in some ways we don't even recognize like how does it benefit me. And so I'd be cautious to like, hospitality is not networking. Wow. Right? I think at times we think I'm going to invite people in because at some point, like, this is going to expand my network or this is going to expand my social platform. And really, I think the act of hospitality is far more sacrificial, right? I think it is an intentional and sacrificial practice in which you say, like, all that I have is actually been given to me, and I am here to steward it on behalf of others or for the sake of others. So Saint Ignatius, who is the founder of the Jesuit tradition, says in his first principle and foundation, like, everything that we have, we receive as a gift, and we have all these gifts and we hold them all as so far as they help us become more loving persons. But if anything takes the center of our lives and displaces this desire to become more loving persons, then it's moving us away from our goal, right? And so how do we hold everything that we have as gift, that we steward on behalf of others, not how do we see everything as kind of platform so that we can expand our network and our reach. So I think that might be a shift, is the underlying, like, why are we being hospitable? And then I think from somebody who, like I said, in my own narrative, and so much of my life has been because of the hospitality of others. I would say once you have experienced the hospitality of others, and your life has because of their generosity, like I would say I am generous because our Father is generous, but I'm also generous because I have experienced the generosity of others, and I think that might be similar to hospitality. I see our home, which is just up the street, and I've been in the same home for 25 years. I see our home as a place to invite other people into, but the reason for that is because I lived in friends' houses when I first started working in churches and couldn't afford my own rent. And so in the same way that like we inherit a faith, I think we also kind of inherit practices of hospitality because we've been the beneficiary of it from other people. Does that help at all,
Oh,
Gloria? Is that guy getting into the right space?
Oh, 100%. That was so good. Yeah, that was so
Yeah.
good. Like, I think it is truly like a ripple effect of like we are able to love other people because we were first loved by our
Yes.
beloved Father, you know? And there's no way for us to make an excuse that I've never really experienced hospitality or whatever, because like our walk with the Lord itself is a testimony of hospitality. He like from day one created a space and a time and place for us to exist and be in communion with him, and also to interact with the only God amongst all the religion that extends hospitality to come where and meet us at where we're at, instead of demanding us to meet where he's at, you know. Like the gospel itself is like the entire testimony of hospitality, like God's hospitality. So like from there we can genuinely like live out a sacrificial life, like we were given an example to follow after. And it's like there's just hard to make up an excuse that we didn't get a good glimpse or example or exposure to it.
And not just on a theological level, right? Because there is like a theological construct, which is that God is a hospitable God, right? And he invites us in on a meta level. But also, as one of the writers says, like you can't read the Gospels without getting hungry, because like the gospel narrative is actually always about somebody sharing a meal with someone. And Jesus is always inviting people literally to meals to be shared. And so I think there is a piece of it that is actually just super practical about like if you want to have one way to move away from a highly individualistic culture, just ask the question, how many meals a week do you eat with other people? Right? Because if the majority of your meals are either alone or only in networking kind of posture, then I would say then you're probably being more formed or deformed by the culture that's around us than by a kingdom narrative, right? Wow. I would say if you just like count the number of meals that you have, that you're inviting other people to share a literal table or share a literal meal, like you begin to understand like, oh, this is actually a part of hospitality. I think one of the most fascinating studies on eating, because it popped in my mind, is you cannot be angry with people you eat with, and you cannot eat with people you're angry with. So if you want to practice, hospitality, it's like eat with people that you don't have a lot in common with. All of a sudden, psychologically, like you will begin to feel a connection and a bond to. And if you want to like figure out how to like repair bridges of broken relationships, it's probably best done over a meal, because there is a psychology that says I cannot eat with people and kind of hold contempt for them. There's something the way that God made us. It just doesn't work that way.
I love that. I love when neuroscience confirms the gospel, right? Like when our psychology, when like secular things just reaffirm God's truths. Like that is so powerful, that when we encounter somebody face to face in a setting that's like this beautiful place where we're sharing a table, which I would argue is one of the most holy places, right? Like it's the Eucharist, right? It's the feast of the table, right? Like when we break bread with other people, that there is a reconciliation that begins in our own hearts and in our own souls towards one another, but also towards the Lord, I feel like. Jared, thanks for sharing all that. I you were talking about practices, and it just got me thinking about the like early church and
Yep.
about the historic church, because I think so often in our Western mindset, you're right, we Martha Stewart everything, which,
Mm.
let's be real, Martha Stewart's only been around for like 30 years, right? Like she's not the end all be all. Before her was Emily Post, right? Like there's always a generation of somebody who's
Yep.
leading people in etiquette and in style. But the reality is that hospitality is like has been a foundational element
Mm.
of the Christian church, and
Mm.
so, like, could you share a little bit of like when, like, as you think about hospitality, as you consider hospitality, like how does the early and historic
Mm.
church inform? How should they inform
Mm.
our practice of hospitality today?
Yeah. Well, I think just to start with, like a framing of the church in kind of the earliest iterations was more home based or household based than it was event based or program based. And so I think at its very nature, shared meals and shared homes and shared lives were kind of the foundational infrastructure of the
Mm,
church.
yeah.
And you have to understand, you're talking about primarily a community of people that was underneath just incredible economic and political persecution. And so you have people without very much sharing all that they have, right? So I think that there's just like some very foundational pieces that are helpful for us to understand what hospitality looked like in the early church. Had to do with homes, it had to do with
Mm,
sacrifice. I think it also had to do with the most radical, right? There's no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. So you have to acknowledge that, like, the social boundaries, ethnic boundaries, kind of cultural segregation that existed in the Roman world was being crossed through hospitality, right?
mm,
Hospitality was, in fact, the primary practice in which people who were following the way of Jesus were claiming a different allegiance and therefore a different practice than the surrounding world around them. So I think that it's always helpful to go back and ask the question, what was happening then? And then ask the question, oh, like eggs cost more now. Like I'm inconvenienced by the cost of eggs. Or like, oh, now we have like some political disagreements,
mm,
or we have some points of tension in our society that maybe feel like they've bubbled up to the surface more so than in the last, decades. Okay, so what are we going to do about that? Hospitality moves towards lack of resources and it moves towards social division
mm.
in the early church. And it does so not in a programmatic way, but in a household home environment. So I would offer, like, some of the things that we are experiencing in our current moment. We have a lot to learn from the early church in just like those basic foundational practices.
Oof. Yeah, I love that. That it moves towards a lack of resource and social division. I think that so many people today don't view their homes as that, right? They view their homes as their own sanctuary away from those things, not as a place where they invite those divisions or to come and sit and have a meal with them, right? And how countercultural in our, specifically in our current cultural moment, to be like, oh, you completely disagree with me, and yet I'm gonna give you the dignity of sitting across the table from me in my house, in a space that is supposed to be right, like your space, and instead inviting them into that. Like, I think that there's a lot of power when we do that.
And I'm going to cook you eggs, right? I'm going to
Yeah.
I'm going
Yeah.
to I'm going to
Yeah, the most
sacrifice my
expensive thing.
grocery budget, right?
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
but I would offer, if you don't have a weekly conversation or a weekly meal with somebody that you don't have much more in common with than Jesus, then, like, there's probably a growth opportunity there.
Mm.
So I think it's just one of the things that we're going to have to get more comfortable with is that we only have Jesus in common with people that we are sitting across the table from. And that's actually enough. Like, Jesus is more than enough to sit across the table from somebody who we have, Jew, Greek, slave free, male, female, has kind of rolled off our tongue really easily, maybe. But now all of a sudden we're like Republican, Democrat, capitalist. I don't know that anybody would
socialist.
I was going to say socialist. I think
Yeah.
people would very much claim socialist, like neo-socialist or something like that, versus like hard capitalism or obviously kind of a progressive, conservative. I think that those delineations are starting to feel more rigid in our cultural context, and I think hospitality is the practice by which we make sure that our allegiance to Jesus is over any other identity that we find ourselves under.
Wow.
I think a lot of times, even we might know our differences or almost be quick to assume our differences before we even come to the table. But I'm curious what it looks like to sort of overcome the temptation of like, okay, I'm sitting at the table with different people from different backgrounds or beliefs or values, and I'm coming to realize that we're very different. And like, how do you manage the tension as you come to recognize like, oh, I don't know if I want to invite this person again back to my table, like it's real. You sit there and like sort of assess like, is this person worth my time? And I think that is the product of our very like individualistic mindset of like, my home is my space, this table is mine, like this time is mine, so I need to be wise about who I invite into it and not. So I think that is naturally where our head, just our pattern of thoughts go to. And I was curious if you had any advice on how do we overcome those temptations as we were naturally formed or guided by the culture and we are trying to walk in the way of Jesus.
That's good, Gloria. Dallas Willard, who is a professor of philosophy, says the only thing that we will take into eternity with us is all that we have become. And so I think at times you have to ask the question, what is more important? Who am I becoming? Or what is my kind of current comfort level in this particular moment? And so if the thing that is most important to you is this week or this month or this year, number of great meals that I had with great people and great food and great wine, and it was a great night, and like I just stocked up, 10 or 20 amazing nights, and it was all about like my experience, and those then that's great. But if all of those didn't lead you to become a more loving person, and therefore actually more aware of like your own need for grace and your own need to extend the hospitality of God as it has been extended to you, and not just like theoretically, but actually practically, then I would question, are we actually becoming who we want to become as people, right? And so I think the tension point is, and I love a great meal with great friends as much as anybody else. So let me be really clear. Like, I'm not some saint that is just consistently, but I am somebody who is asking the question at 51 that maybe I wasn't asking at 25, which is, who am I becoming? And I think that that's maybe the question is like, who are you becoming because of the people that are sitting around the table with you?
Wow. Yeah. That's a beautiful way actually to begin to wrap up this conversation. I think, who are we becoming? As the church of the city of Denver, who are we becoming? And are we becoming a place, a people, right? As a collective, large C church, big C church, a place where the downcast, the downtrodden, the people who don't want to associate with us, where they actually feel welcome, and where they begin to experience the gospel at work, like the true gospel, this hospitable king who did eat a lot of food and was actually considered a glutton, right? Like that was one of his biggest things. They're like, this guy eats too much. And so
one thing can I add to the end?
Yeah, go for it, Glow. Yeah,
I think it just reminded me of this imagery. I don't know where the source is from, but I was introduced when I was back in Asia, and obviously so the image of table in hell looks like there's lots of food, lots of water. It is available out there, but everybody has a chopstick, not a fork, not a spoon, but a chopstick, and it's so long that you cannot feed your own, like yourself with the chopstick because it's too long. Whereas like the presentation in Kingdom of Heaven, the table looks like everybody can reach the food, but we're feeding one another. Like, how beautiful is that if we actually live our lives not just trying to see if what can benefit me or like me centered, but like if we actually just shift a little bit towards like serving other people, that comes with a cost, that comes with a sacrifice, and just the wholesome picture of like everybody feeding one another. That's like a representation of the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah. Yeah, what a beautiful image, Glow. Thanks for sharing that. Well, Jared, thank you so much. Seriously, thanks for your wisdom. Thanks for taking time. Thanks for engaging with us at a coffee shop. That's so fun. I love it. Especially right then, as I said that, and there's a little kid screaming in the background. I love it. And so thank you so much for taking some time to join us. We really do appreciate you being here. And yeah, thanks everyone else for joining for the Made Live podcast. Make sure to tune in next week as we continue our conversation on hospitality.
Thanks, friends.
Oh, thanks. Thank you so much.